In today's episode of Children of Heroes, we headed to northwest London to Golders Green, where we interviewed siblings Daniel and Eve Allen, children of Mr. Emil Apfelbaum.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your father served in the Navy during the Second World War. In fact, when the Nazis took over Czechoslovakia, he was captured by Gestapo, but managed to escape.
Yes, that's right. So he was on Ostrava at that time, and they picked up a lot of Jewish youths on the street and just shoved them into the back of a truck. It wasn't clear what the purpose was. But when they came to a stop, some of the youths near the door noticed that it hadn't been locked properly at the back, and they escaped. And naturally the Nazis chased after them. But my dad waited behind, and when they'd gone round the corner, he went to a nearby doorstep where there was a churn of milk and stood there with the churn pretending to be the milkman, so that when the Nazis came back, they didn't think he was one of the youths, and they didn't bother to chase him. But this made him realise that he had to get out.
How did he come to the United Kingdom?
He escaped across the Silesian border because the Poles were fighting the Czechs at this time, and the border was fluid, and he went to Krakow to stay with relatives there, and he worked at the Jewish refugee centre. Yeah, what he obtained was a ticket. Because he was actually involved in issuing tickets to refugees.
Right.
And I think my understanding is that there's again a little imagination there. He issued himself a ticket, and then you say he went from
Well,
Gdansk.
he told me he got out of Poland via the port of Gdansk.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then he came to the UK at that point.
He then decided to join the Navy.
Yeah.
He was responsible for supplying the Allied armies.
Yes. So the merchant navy was a very important part of the war effort. People weren't able to get war supplies and indeed food, and a lot of that had to come from North America.
Yeah.
So they had convoys which went, maybe 50 ships escorted by 2 military ships, and of course the Nazis tried to bomb those convoys.
And our father was torpedoed twice. He survived falling into the water. He held on to wreckage. The merchant navy, my understanding was it took the highest casualties in the war of any service. And it was an extremely important part of the war effort because the merchant navy is what kept supplies coming into England.
Yeah, and he was with different nationalities. So we again saw from the police records he was with Greek, Dutch,
Norwegian.
One British, but mainly
Norwegian
ships.
ships.
So he picked up a little Norwegian.
Yeah.
And in fact, the history shows that Norway provided the Allies with the biggest merchant fleet. But unfortunately, as a result of that, he had all his possessions with him, and so he
lost them all. He lost them all. That was, he had no pictures, or virtually none. The only pictures we have are those that were given to him later by his brother, who had gone to Israel, to Palestine, as it then was, in the 1930s. And he had pictures with him, but our father lost everything in terms of his memories, his pictures of the family. They all went to the bottom of the sea, basically, because he was torpedoed.
After the war, he stayed in the United Kingdom?
Yes, he was naturalised.
So we now know that he was in the merchant navy actually until 1949. So he was moving back and forth. But by that stage, he'd met our mother in West Hampstead, and he'd married her, and he had to settle.
Yes.
And it was quite interesting that the record shows that he was a little unsettled at that point.
Yes, which is the same story we heard from our mother, that he found it very hard to settle back down on land because he basically spent 10 years travelling the world in the Navy, and like a lot of sailors, he just found it hard to settle back down on land and give up the travelling lifestyle. And I think he inspired us, don't you think, with all his stories of around the world, you know, to want to travel, because that always remained in him, that he enjoyed it. I remember hearing stories of playing football on the equator. I can't remember which African country, it might have been Kenya, I'm not sure. He went to a number of African countries and he basically travelled the entire world in that time whilst he was in the Navy.
What did he do after his marriage, when he settled?
Initially, he had a number of minor jobs. He was a decorator, an upholsterer. Yeah, but he really only came into his own, as it were, when his brother in Israel invited him over to learn the diamond trade, which at that time was centred in Israel. And in fact, even to this day, there's a major centre there in Ramat Gan.
He learned cutting and polishing. So he did that for many years. He was a tradesman doing cutting and polishing, and he had a big wheel in the cellar of our house, we remember, don't we, when we were children.
Prior to that, when in the garage of that previous house.
In the garage of the original house, and then when we moved, it was in the cellar.
Yes.
And he had a big wheel, that's what's used, or I don't know if it still is at that time, for cutting and polishing. Yeah. And he would have this thing on his head to protect from the dust, from all the diamond dust. And he would spend hours.
Yeah, I'd often go and sit there with him, and he had a dustpan and brush and a sieve. And that's because every now and again the diamond would fly off, and you'd have to brush it all up on the floor and find the diamond with the sieve. You know, it's this massively expensive, tiny thing. But eventually he started trading in diamonds as well, but I don't think he ever really got us to the stage where he could only do that. So he was really doing both until he retired.
His mother and sister died in a concentration camp. When and how did he find out?
Well, I think it's a good question, because I'm not sure that either of our parents actually did find out, actually know the truth. Because my father wrote on the Yad Vashem papers that they died on the way to Auschwitz. And I think someone had said that to him as a way of kind of making him feel better. And like so many Holocaust survivors, they didn't, either of them, really want to hear what happened. So actually what happened is that they were taken to Theresienstadt in, I think it was late summer or early autumn 1942, and a month or so later they were just taken to Treblinka, where they died.
His father survived, and
yes,
he returned to Czechoslovakia.
He did.
It was a very interesting story.
Yes.
So his father was part of the NISCO plan, which was a plan by Eichmann to try and put Jews into southern Poland, out of the way in some muddy, marshy area. And they took 1,000 Jews from Vienna and 1,000 Jews from Ostrava, and they put them on trains and they took them there and said, hey, build a village. And of course, they didn't have the skills to do that, most of them. So they sent half the Jews back to Czechoslovakia, where obviously most of them perished in the Holocaust. But my grandfather, in one version, he escaped from the train, that's what my dad said.
Yeah.
But historically,
I remember.
Anyway, half of the Jews from Nisko were just pushed across the line
Russian
of demarcation.
border,
And so he lived in Lvov, Lemberg, Lviv, as it is now, for about a year, quite near to the centre. And I've been to see where he used to live. But the Nazis then took all the Jews as the Germans were approaching, because I know it's crazy to us now, but they thought that the Jews would side with the Germans.
You mean?
Yes, they thought that they would be fifth columnists. Obviously, it's when we look at through the historical lens, it's crazy, but that's what they thought. They took them all to various parts. My grandfather was unfortunate enough to be taken to Siberia, where his cousin also went, and he died in his arms, is the story.
The cousin, yeah. So the Russians were afraid that, because you said the Germans, that's why you were confused. The Russians were afraid that the Jews would be fifth columnists.
Sorry.
The Russians took them into...
the Russians,
Yeah, and then he was sent to Siberia. Our grandfather was in Siberia.
Yeah, when the Soviets could see the way things were going, and they also were running short of people, the Czech Free Army was allowed to be born in Buzuluk in southern Russia. And my grandfather was allowed to go there. But it looks as if, because of his age, he was above fighting age. So he then made his way back to Czechoslovakia. And he took up his old job, apparently, as a
painter and decorator.
Yeah.
My grandfather.
After the communist coup in 1948.
Yes. Well, my grandfather apparently said he had had quite enough of the communists, or the Soviets anyway. And the moment the coup happened, he got straight on a plane, left everything behind, and went to stay with his
son
our uncle,
in Israel, our uncle. Yeah.
Well, Palestine.
Just left everything, just took
February.
a suitcase, and the clothes on his back. I mean, he'd rebuilt his business, hadn't he?
Absolutely.
He'd got a home, he'd rebuilt his business, even though he'd lost his wife and his daughter, and one son was still in, it was in England, one son was in Israel. He just said that's it. He had enough of totalitarianism, basically. His life experience had told him what it brought, and he preferred to leave everything, just take his suitcase and get on a plane whilst he still could.
After the Velvet Revolution, your father took you to Czechoslovakia to visit the places where he used to live.
Yes.
What was it like for you?
Yes, he'd sort of sent me by proxy in communist times, and I'd misidentified where his house was. But I remember it being very dark and dismal. But as soon as the Velvet Revolution happened, we both decided to go together, and it was very nice. We stayed at, I can't remember the name of the hotel, but it was his childhood memory of this grand hotel in his hometown at the end of the street. Of course, it was a normal hotel, but as a child, it was a big deal. So this was very nice for him. And we went to see where his house used to be. His house wasn't, in fact, there anymore, and nor was his synagogue. I mean, the synagogue was obviously destroyed by the Nazis.
I think it was cathartic for him, wasn't it? Because it was literally years and years and years he'd never been able to go back. Our mother, being Austrian from Vienna, she'd been able to go back, so she'd imbued us with a sort of a love of Austrian culture, of Vienna. She'd taken us, she showed us, we'd seen everything. But my father felt never able to go back because Czechoslovakia was under the communists, and he was very worried about that. And so when he was able to go back with his son, I think it was a very cathartic experience for him.
And also we visited Prague, which he'd never been to, which was a lovely experience. And the big memory I have was how the horrible, dark, black and white Czechoslovakia of communist times had started to light up. Just every now and again, a little bit of private enterprise, colourful umbrellas and things like that.
You became a psychologist?
Psychiatrist, which is a medical specialty, yeah.
What made you choose this profession?
It chose me, is the short answer to that. So I qualified as a doctor at the age of about 23, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And I meandered around medical specialties, doing orthopaedics, and then I decided to do general practice. And I did all the training I needed for general practice except psychiatry, which I felt I needed to do because it was an important part of everyday general practice life. And I went to the local hospital where I was training as a GP, and I said, have you got a 6-month job? And they said, no, we have a 12-month job, and you have every Thursday off during term time to do the academic study for psychiatry. And I loved it so much that I stayed in it, and I've been in it now for 37 years. I have to say that our parents were very relaxed about the idea of travelling. So when the opportunity arose to go and work in Australia, because Australians, GPs had given up working at nights and they needed other people to come and do the work, I took a chunk of time off, worked there in the end for 8 months, but also travelled a lot on the way there through Southeast Asia and through the Pacific on the way back.
When you were still an undergraduate, you did your elective in South Africa, didn't you? In Natal, wasn't it?
In KwaZulu.
KwaZulu.
Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
KwaZulu. Which is Natal now, isn't it?
It's KwaZulu-Natal,
yeah. Yeah, KwaZulu-Natal. In the old days of apartheid, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He worked with the Zulu people in quite a remote area, I seem to recall.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
You studied international history?
I did originally. I studied international history and politics. Ended up, I changed that course, did politics and German. I also travelled a lot. I spent 6 months in Vienna as part of my course. Shortly after I graduated, I went to live in Israel. That was always my ambition. And I lived in Israel for several years. Wound up coming back. I didn't really settle into a profession until I had my children. I became a probation officer, which is something I've been doing ever since. I spent time in Israel. I did voluntary work. Funnily enough, I also worked in a psychiatric hospital. I wasn't qualified as my brother was, but I think we were both sort of drawn to that sort of area, psychology and psychiatry. And even in the work I do now, there's a lot of that involved. The work I do now is very much one-to-one with people. I've been doing that for the past 23 years now.
Do you think that your father's Czech origin have influenced your life?
He never taught us Czech. Our mother taught us both German, and I went on to university to study German. And I always used to say to my dad, why don't you teach us Czech? Why didn't you teach us Czech? Because we always heard him speaking Czech to his brother. And when his brother came over, there was always a lot of excitement, wasn't there? Uncle Oscar was coming.
And they always spoke in Czech.
And they always spoke in Czech together, which used to irritate my mum because she couldn't understand it. Because at home we spoke a mixture of German and English, or they did, didn't they? They did.
Yes, because my father, of course, was born in 1920. People still spoke German. So he spoke German and Yiddish.
And Polish, he had fluent Polish,
and Czech.
But Czech was his childhood language. That was the language he spoke with his brother.
He also spoke Russian. Probably.
He spoke it quite well. Yeah. But with respect, yes, I do think so, in terms of his Czech origins, because he always spoke very fondly of Czechoslovakia, and that's the truth. Yeah. He had a happy childhood in Czechoslovakia, and he did like the Czech people very much. Yeah. And he enjoyed speaking Czech with his brothers, which was not an opportunity he had on an everyday basis, as my mother wasn't Czech speaking.
I've developed a very warm feeling for Czechia, and I've been, as I say, several times now. And, you know, I'm aware of the history of Masaryk and his support for Zionism, which I think resulted in my uncle going to Israel and therefore his life being saved. And, you know, the history of Czechoslovakia helping Israel with arms.
Helping Israel with arms in 1948 was something we were very aware of, that we learnt about. And also that the Czech Republic still often supports Israel in the United Nations today, which is something that makes us very happy.